I'm really interested.
Brandon, thank you for being with us.
I signed up for a whole.
Anna, thank you so much for the warm welcome, the introduction, as well as the opportunity. And thanks to all of you for joining us on this Thursday afternoon, well, Tuesday afternoon, rather, wherever you may happen to be. I didn't realize that we were having an international audience. Unfortunately, a lot of content here is sort of US specific, but not to say that you couldn't sort of get some valuable content out of this as well, right? So like Anna said, and I just want to make sure everyone can see my screen. Pretty sure you can, but if you can't, let me know.
I can see it.
Perfect. Thanks, Hannah. So, like I said, I'm a senior technology strategist working in Microsoft's state and local government practice. I'm based out of Boston, Mass. If you're local to Boston, I actually live in Quincy, which is not Boston, but if you're not from here, well, I'm Boston, right? I've been at Microsoft for about 2 years, right? So in that time, I'd like to think that in the grand scheme of our team, I have the fun job, and it's because I get to play with the technology and also get to work with our customers specifically in the state government space to help solve problems, right? Sometimes it's old technology. Sometimes, like what we're going to discuss today, it's something that's relatively new, groundbreaking, right? Bleeding edge, right? So with that, the scope for today is what you need to know about writing a prompt for AI tools, right? So AI tools come, in sort of variety of different shapes and sizes and flavors, right? So I think specifically we'll ground the conversation today on generative AI.
You're welcome, Roy. Thank you. Have a great day.
All right. So before we get to that, just a little bit about me. Originally from St. Thomas in the U.S. Virgin Islands. Most of my family lives back in the Caribbean, so get the opportunity to head back there quite a bit. I also train Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, so get to stay active, and at least I've got get out of jail free card or a reason to get out of the office at 6 o'clock every day. So working at Microsoft currently, but prior to that, I spent a number of years working at the state legislature, for which I think I want to say I saw 1 or 2 familiar names on this call from the state house there. So hello. But I had a lot of great opportunity working directly, supporting, sort of the organization as well as the business, like giving me a good sort of visibility in terms of sort of what are some of the challenges that, not just legislatures, but sort of all branches of government and workers in there will typically face, right? So for our agenda today, so we're going to ground ourselves on what is generative AI, right? We're going to talk a little bit about what are prompts, right? You may have heard the term prompt engineering. We'll kind of unwind that and hopefully simplify that and then put that into practice so that we can get more out of our generative AI tools, right? So from a tooling perspective, I think I wanted to focus this discussion today on tools that you folks can use along with me today, or that are generally freely available, right? So I think from our perspective here at Microsoft, leveraging Microsoft Copilot through either the sidebar in the Edge browser. So if you don't have the Edge browser, it's freely available. You can get this on Windows, on Mac OS, and it has a very interesting, we'll get to when we get to the demo portion, we'll sort of step through how to use that. But that's where we're going to spend most of our time today. So if you're interested in driving along, by all means, you can leverage Edge. What I will say, though, is that in organizations where if you're using a managed computer, right, if you're at work right now, chances are it's possible that the administrators at your organization may have restricted access to that Edge sidebar, in which case you may just want to head to bing.com and then select Copilot, right? So wanted to make sure that we were using tools that were, freely available, accessible. There's no, paywall or anything along those lines. The benefit there is we actually give you access to GPT-4, which is sort of like the latest and the greatest of the large language models, at least so far. And there's no cost associated with that. So you get to kick the tires, right? And then I think the fun part of this is we're going to step through some prompts, leveraging those best practices, but applied in a government context to solve what I would consider to be real world problems, or at least examples of what could be real world problems for us. And then last but not least, we've got time at the end for a Q&A. All right. So first question, well, before we even get to prompts, is what is generative AI, right? So AI has been around for quite a while, and it's had an influence and an impact in a number of aspects of our lives, right? But I feel as if the past year or so, generative AI has really taken center stage in its ability to really sort of, and I don't want to use the pun, but like transform the industry, right? So whenever we hear the word, where we hear chat GPT, right? The GPT at the end actually stands for generative pre-trained transformer. And effectively, that's just a fancy way of saying that it's a language expert. And it's a language expert that's powered by an immense database of internet, books, PDFs, content. Basically, you can think of all of the internet, of all of the information that may be available on the internet, or at least a subset of that, is really what is the heart of the GPT, right? You may have also heard the term large language model, right? These effectively refer to the same thing, at least for the purposes of our conversation today. I think for the purposes of this conversation, we're going to keep things relatively high level, right? There are prompt engineering courses out there that get really deep into the weeds. I think we want to sort of keep things high level so that it's as accessible as possible, right? While you may have heard of ChatGPT, there are also other GPTs out there. There's something called the Codex model, and that's a GPT that's been specifically trained to produce code, right? So think Python, C#, Java, Ruby for my developers out there, right? Things that languages that you know and love, right? And then last but not least, Dolly is a modified GPT that's specifically designed and trained to craft or create images, right? Based on text descriptions. Please create an apple sitting on a teacher's desk, right? And it will draw that for you, right? So prompting specifically is how you chat with the large language model, right? It's how you kick off a question or a starting point. And it's really the means by which we're able to tap into the knowledge and the capabilities of the large language model, right? So in terms of prompts, right, I feel like there's a lot of complexity or an air of complexity around the topic of prompt engineering, right? It sounds fancy. It's like, oh, we've got to be an engineer. Like, full disclosure, I am not an engineer. I am an aspiring developer and I'm a technologist. I've been at this for a while. But that being said, I think the advent of large language models is particularly interesting because we are all now developers. We're all engineers. We're all coders, right? And the reason for that is because the programming language is English. So that's where we're going to spend our time today, right? I think we could finish right now. Talk's over. Prompts are instructions, right? So every time you hear prompt engineering or prompt optimizing prompts, like we're talking about instructions, right? The best way to look at a large language model, or the way that we interact with a large language model, is to pretend as if it's an assistant working on it, starting on its very first day on the job. It doesn't have context, it doesn't have experience, it may have knowledge, but it doesn't necessarily know how to apply that to be effective for my needs, right? So it's absolutely critical that we spend time being very deliberate in terms of how we provide instructions to the model so that we can get the answers or the responses that we're looking for, right? So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about a framework for how we evaluate or how we assess our prompts that we give our large language model. And forgive me, there's only 2 more slides and then we get to the fun part, right? So as we step through our prompts, right, we'll typically look at them in the lens, or evaluate them with the lens of these 5 criteria, right? Context, right? Context is everything with the large language models. From what point of view am I asking it to write something? From what domain of knowledge am I asking it to provide an answer, right? In terms of instructions, what am I asking it to do, right? Am I asking it to draft an email or a LinkedIn post? Am I asking it to compare and contrast to disparate items? Maybe I'm asking it to list something, right? In terms of questions, I may very well just be asking a question or maybe having an action, right? There's some overlap between these two categories, so don't necessarily read a lot too much into it. But I think for me, if I were to prioritize two, I would say the context and the output are probably the most significant. And those are what we'll look at our prompts as we step through these in a moment. Examples is another element of an effective prompt. Idea being, if I'm asking for something, maybe if I'm asking my large language model to assess a body of text, for example, maybe an email to see whether or not a constituent is eligible for a particular program, I may want to give it an example of a message from a constituent where they are eligible, and maybe an example of a message from a constituent where that constituent was ineligible, right? Basically training it or pre-training it rather to give us the answer or the response that we're looking for. And last but certainly not least is output. And the question is, like, what are you looking for in terms of output? Are we looking for a paragraph, a sentence, an email, a draft of a formal letter? Are we looking for a blog post, right? And we'll talk a little bit in a moment about formatted output, which I think is probably one of the more interesting things about being able to leverage Bing, is because we're able to output in a number of formats that I think are going to be particularly useful for this audience, right? So moving on to just some general tips around prompting and large language models. Sort of how do we give instructions, right? So use direct instruction. Right, and clear questions. It sounds like it sounds pretty simple, right? But I feel very early on when ChatGPT sort of hit the site, there was no instruction manual, right? There was no, this is the guide to ChatGPT. It was just sort of, you would get in and you'd ask some questions, and maybe you'd get some very interesting responses. It might be right, it might be wrong. Maybe some consideration about how you may apply that to an enterprise context, but you want to be direct. You want to be concise with your language. Additionally, like I said, context. We want to make sure that we're providing any relevant information or data that's going to support the output that we're looking for, right? We want to make sure that we can give some examples in our prompts if that's something that perhaps the model's not giving you the answer that you're looking for. There's also a technique where we effectively iterate, where we start with a simple prompt, maybe something like, hey, give me a list of RMV locations that are closest to Quincy, Massachusetts. It's actually one we've got on the list, right? And then we can continue to ask questions based on that context, right, to further refine the results that we're getting, right? We also have the ability to use personas, right? Like this is a powerful tool that we'll show in a minute. And then last, but certainly not least, is using delimiters in programming speak, or separators, right? If I'm referencing content, perhaps an article, maybe an email, I can include that in my prompt, in my instruction, but I want to make sure I include that in quotes or curly braces or brackets so that it's clear to the model the difference between my prompt and the data or the information that I'm referencing, right? And we'll show a few examples of that in a moment, right? So with that, let's transition to the fun stuff, right? So feel free to work alongside, but I'm leveraging Edge. This is actually my personal computer, so it's not managed by an organization. We do give enterprise administrators the ability to restrict access to this sort of thing. So we've seen that some agencies have seen fit to do that. So again, if you're at work and you have Edge, there's a possibility that this might be disabled for you, in which case you can feel free just to head over to bing.com and click on Copilot. But I'm going to open up the Copilot Edge page here, right? And now I still have the ability to browse to websites, but I've got the large language model, or the GPT, available here on the sidebar so that it can help as I'm, sort of doing my work, right? I think the differentiator here, particularly when you're leveraging a tool like Bing versus maybe some, tools like OpenAI's ChatGPT, is that Bing has access to the internet, right? So you're layering a search engine on top of our large language model to go and research, find and source information and then build that information into the responses, right? So I think that's going to be particularly useful in some of the examples that I'm going to show in a moment. All right, so it's a very simple example of how we can leverage a prompt is to translate text, right? I know we can translate hundreds of languages leveraging ChatGPT and leveraging Bing. So an example of a prompt here, I'm just going to go ahead and paste this in, right? And I hope the sizing is okay. If not, I might be able to resize here, but I'll read the prompt aloud, right? Translate the text below into Brazilian Portuguese, right? So from a action perspective, I'm asking it to translate. From a context, I'm asking it to translate what? The text that's below, and you'll notice that I've included that text in quotes, so it is clear to the model what I'm asking to translate into Brazilian Portuguese. I'll go ahead and submit that and wait for that to come back. And for those of you who out there who are either Portuguese or Brazilian Portuguese speakers, you can keep us honest here. But based on my, rudimentary understanding, it looks somewhat correct, right? And then I can likewise translate that into, subsequently into a number of languages. So I think that based on all of the capabilities that we're going to discuss today, realize that we have the ability to leverage this tool not only to, sort of generate insights based on a number of data points and pieces of information, but we also have the ability just to translate, which I think, has been around for a while, but the ability for us to ask questions in one language and receive responses in another is particular, and with the language translation happening on the fly, is of particular value, right? So I'm going to go ahead and reset this session, resetting the context for the session, because like in a good assistant anyway, just remember the last prompt or the last instruction you gave it. So in this case, I want to wipe the slate clean, right? And I'll give an example of editing text, right? And these are very rudimentary examples. We're going to step into things that are a little bit more advanced, right? So pasting in a new example, draft an email. That's my action.
Brandon,
Yes.
can I interrupt you for a second? Sure. There's a few folks in the chat who are having some trouble getting to the page. Could you maybe just walk through for folks again how to get onto Copilot so they can follow along with you and put in their own prompts?
Absolutely. So I'm in the Edge browser, so I'm using the Edge bar. But if you're using a different browser, what you can do is just go to bing.com, right? And in the top of the screen, you'll see just to the right of the Microsoft Bing logo, we have the chat option. And then you'll get to a page that's very similar to the sidebar. And when I say similar, because when we get to some of the more advanced examples, we're going to be drawing on information that's actually in the browser. You'll notice I've got a few tabs preloaded with content. So you'll be able to follow along to begin with, but referencing the content, you would need to be using the Edge browser. So I hope that's helpful.
Thank you.
All right. So the prompt that we're adding here is draft an email to the Connecticut Department of Revenue Services asking for details about the statewide cannabis tax. Right. So I'm being very deliberate. What's the output that I want? I want an email, right? I'm asking it to draft something, right? What is the something? I'm like, what's the context? It's to the Connecticut Department of Revenue Services. The what is about the state cannabis tax, right? And I'm getting a relatively generic email. Hi, sir or madam. Hope this finds you well, et cetera, et cetera. But perhaps I want to change the voice. I want to change the tone of this message, right? Straightforward. I'm just going to enter the text, redraft this email to be more friendly, right? So I don't necessarily need to capture the essence of what I'm trying to accomplish on the first pass, right? Because it's remembering the context. I can continue to iterate. I can continue to work on this and ask it to revise, redraft, re-add until I get the result that I'm looking for, right? So I just asked it redraft to be a little bit more friendly, right? Hey, we got an extra line. I hope this email finds you well, etc. Hey, but to add a little bit more color here, perhaps I want to add a paragraph, or rather, I'm interested in opening a cannabis dispensary in Connecticut later this year. And that's really the context for my message, right? So I'm going to say add a paragraph indicating that I'm interested in opening a cannabis dispensary in Waterbury later this year, right? Doing my best to apply very clear intentions. What am I asking for? I want a paragraph, right? What is the context? It is of me opening a cannabis dispensary in Waterbury, which is not happening anytime soon, but nonetheless, right, you'll see that I've gotten, additionally, I'm interested in opening a cannabis. Would you please provide me with additional information on requirements, procedures, etc., right? And I can continue to iterate on this until I have the end result that I'm looking for, right? But the idea is we don't necessarily, it's not a one and done. We don't necessarily need to just ask one, have like a mega prompt where we ask for sort of all, and try to refine that to get all of the things we want on the first shot. We can continue to refine until we get what we need.
Brandon, can I also ask you to zoom into the right-hand side of your screen as you're doing the prompts, just so we can see the text that it's delivering a little bit easier?
Let me see. So the only struggle is like I can zoom the left-hand side, the content, but the edge sidebar specifically isn't zoomable.
Okay, got you.
So I hope it's not too much of an obstacle here.
No, that's all right. Especially helpful when you read out some parts of it.
Perfect. All right. So to transition over to formatted output, I feel like now this is where we're sort of get to sort of the, we'll call like the meat and the potatoes here. So I'm going to ask for a list in this case. I'm going to ask for a list of 5 registry of motor vehicle locations that are closest to where I live, Quincy, Mass. Right. The benefit here is even if the model itself, right, didn't actually have the information in terms of where these locations are, Bing has the ability to search the internet and then return those results to me in real time. Right. So I asked, and I was very specific in my prompt. I wanted 5 what RMV locations and then where in Quincy, Mass. Right. But I didn't really articulate or specify the format. So it just gave me a numbered list. Right. But maybe I'm, putting together, something, a new employee package or something along those lines, or maybe I want to use this information in a different context. Right. So I can go ahead and specify a format. List these locations in a table. Now, interestingly enough, I didn't go so far as to specify what columns I was looking for, right? But it made some assumptions and specified location, address, distance, as well as the hours in which they're available. All right. And there's a little inconsistency here. When I was working with this yesterday, I actually would get an Excel icon here that I could click on, and I could actually download this as an Excel spreadsheet, which, in this example, may be more or less useful, but I think in some more real world, like applicable answer, like where we're at, like really sort of asking for like a large quantity of data, right? It can be particularly useful for us to quickly export that into Excel. But nonetheless, we have the ability to highlight, copy and paste this in if we needed to, right? In the interest of time, likewise, for my developers out there, perhaps I have an application specific, use case that I need to use this information for. I'd be able to say, hey, well, convert this to JSON format. For those of you that are unfamiliar, JSON is a pretty standard format for presenting, let's say, sort of like structured data for use in applications, right? So it understands the format that I'm looking for. It understands when I say convert this, this in this case is the output of my previous prompt, right? Which was the table that we had. So now this is something that I can then copy and paste into a database that I'm working on, maybe an application or a system, right? And use this information in a more meaningful way, right? So this is the portal that I use, right? But ultimately, I'm looking to try to solve a problem here, and this is helping me do that. Right.
Brandon, can I interrupt you for a second?
Sure.
On my edge, there's a little divide between the presentation and the Copilot, and I can slide my Copilot screen to the left and make it very large.
Is your Copilot,
You can make it even larger.
so it's funny you say this. I was actually researching this internally yesterday. Mine, if you notice, as I slide mine to the left, right, while the window itself gets larger, the text does not.
Oh, okay.
And
Just a thought.
even if you hold control and spin up or down on the mouse wheel, you don't get any change in size as you
Okay.
would.
My text got larger, actually.
Well, I'm jealous. You're gonna have to maybe if you can throw in the chat maybe what platform you're using. I'd just be curious to see if you're using Edge, maybe what version of Edge, because this
I'm
is something
using the
that,
latest version of Edge.
okay. So in the interest of time, I'll just continue. I hope the text isn't too small for folks to see. Again, I'll continue to read the prompts aloud. So I hope that's still helpful. All right. So in terms of content creation, right, I think this is a particularly advantageous use case for large language models. Why? Because it's time consuming, right? Most of the time, writing emails is not a pleasurable experience, nor is writing things like press releases, right? But they're things that we need to do, and they're very impactful for the business, right? So being able to leverage a tool like Copilot or ChatGPT in order to do that is like very critical, right? So I have a prompt: draft a press release for a government agency announcing the launch of a new solar energy rebate program, right? Now, this is a prompt is relatively generic, right? Because if I'm actually in need of a press release, right? Like I work at a specific government agency in a specific state or locality, and I'm going to need some details on that rebate program, right? So without those details, Bing or ChatGPT will sort of take it upon itself to be creative and provide a framework and make some assumptions, right? But in order for this to be impactful, particularly from working in state government, I might want to refine this so that I can get something that's a little bit more useful to what I'm trying to accomplish, right? So we'll use a new prompt, right? And to read it aloud: you are a communications director for the Rhode Island Office of Energy Resources. The agency is launching a solar energy rebate program on February 1st called Road to Renewables. Get it? Which will provide rebates to homeowners who've had solar systems installed. The program will pay a maximum of $20,000, and homeowners may apply online at ri.gov. Draft a one-page press release announcing this program, right? This is a long prompt, but an important one. And I'm going to go ahead and kick that off. But the reason is because I'm applying a persona, right? I'm giving it, hey, you are a communications director, right? Which may not be all that obvious, but provides a certain level of context to the large language model to affect the way, the tone, the structure of the content that's being generated here, right? And because I've gone on to add additional details, such as the road of the program, the launch date, the maximum payouts, as well as where homeowners can apply, right? I'm getting a much more, I would say, effective or closer to an end product of what I would want versus just the generic draft a press release, right? So in the interest of time, I'm going to pivot to referencing external content because I feel like that is the most impactful, at least as I've seen through some of these examples that we've put together today, right? So context is everything, at least in this case when we're working with the large language model. So the benefit of leveraging Bing in the sidebar in this instance, and something that I learned right recently, was that we can limit the context to the site that we're currently browsed to, right? So in this case, I have an executive order from Governor Glenn Youngkin in Commonwealth of Virginia, and it's an executive order on artificial intelligence, which we're seeing come across from multiple states, right? So leveraging Bing, I can actually set the context to this specific document, right? So I'll use the prompt, and I'll be very direct in terms of my ask. My question is, please summarize. That's my action. Summarize the executive order from where from this page into a few sentences, right? I'll go ahead and submit that. And effectively what's happening here is the document that I'm on, if it's local to my computer, it's actually being uploaded to Bing, and Bing is, so this is an interesting, so I'm actually going to go ahead and reset. And this is actually a good call out, right? I actually spent some time over the past few days testing each one of these prompts to ensure that the output is, as expected, right? In that instance, it was actually giving me information for an executive order that was not on the screen at all. I think it was an executive order from 2 years ago, right? So realize that there are limitations in some of these platforms, right? Yeah, the design, at least the way that we look at them internally, is to get us maybe 70 or 80% of the way there, with the remaining 20% being one, validation. You can see it's coming back and it's giving me the same thing, right? January of 2021. So in some cases now I can, because this is a public order, right? I can even go so far as to say something along the lines of, please summarize the executive order number 30 in 2024 from Glenn Youngkin, right? And Bing will search the internet and capture this information for me. But just realize, I think it's like a good call out that, working with the models, they're not perfect, right? But I want to move on to another example. It's a relatively simple one. And the example here, and the context here is a grant program for students here in the Commonwealth. It's called the Cash Grant, right? And what we're going to ask is to create a FAQ for that grant program based on the information from this site. So first, let's reset. And again, create a FAQ for the Cash Grant program based on the information detailed on the site. So the model, effectively what we've done is we've actually taken the entire contents of this document and submitted it with our prompt, asking for a possible FAQ. So it's got the context of the entire document, and it's able to summarize that. And based on my ask for an FAQ, right, understanding Q&A structure and what are some of the common questions that we would expect in an FAQ to address, it's able to generate that pretty easily, right? So I want to move on to another example, and we can reset the context here. Here in the Commonwealth, Governor Healy announced a pretty sizable spending program, a capital spending program for modernizing IT, right? Something which I think we all welcome to sort of improve innovation and security, et cetera, right? But imagine I'm a social media manager. In fact, you know what? I'm going to tell Copilot, you are a social media manager for Massachusetts Governor Maura Healey, tasked with sharing content on LinkedIn. Cleverly or creatively condense the press release on this site into a concise and valuable summary that presents the essence of the content and delivers immediate value to your audience. Now, some of the language, I'd say, like, I'll characterize it as the flowery language there, may not necessarily have a significant impact on the quality of the response that I get here, but by just alone giving it the context or the persona of you are a social media manager, right, comes along with it certain writing styles. It comes along with, and within the writing styles in terms of word choice as well as length and formatting, et cetera, right? So I'm giving it a better perspective in terms of what is the output that I'm looking for, right? And this is actually pretty good, right? I've got a headline, bolded, right? I've got a bulleted list here that breaks down some of the key points from this press release. And I could simply copy and paste this into LinkedIn, right? Maybe I want to make some refinements based on sort of some stylistic standards that the office has, right? And we're ready to go. All right. Another example that I want to give is with respect to constituent services, right? So this is a website for the New Jersey Motor Vehicle Commission, and it outlines some of the steps that a first-time applicant for a driver's license would need to take, right? Taking the knowledge test, practice driving, et cetera, right? So this is the criteria. right? What I'm going to do is we can leverage Bing Chat, or frankly any large language model, to draft email replies, which I think we might have done earlier, right? But in this case, I'm saying draft an email reply to the message below using information from this site, right? So I'm drafting a response, but in this case, you'll see I've got email text. I need to delete that, right? And that's an example of formatting the content that I want to reference, right? So I could use quotes, I could use curly braces. In that case, I had square brackets, but in this case, I'll use 2 quotes if you can't see them, they're too small, right? And I've got an email, assumably coming from a constituent. Dear New Jersey MVC, I'm writing to inquire about the process of obtaining a first driver's license in New Jersey. I'm a resident, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right. So what have I got? I've got an instruction. I want to draft an email reply. Right. What do I want to base that reply on? I want to base that on the information that's on this website. Right. And then what is the email that we're referencing? It's this email here that's in quotes from Bradley James. Right. So this is like, I'd say like a little bit more of an advanced use case, in the sense that we're providing information in terms of the email. We're also referencing information that's publicly available through a website, and we're using that information to help craft our response here, right? So you can see it's drafting that email and it's pulling the content from that website in order to help construct that reply, right? Like laying out some of the criteria or the steps that need to be taken. I'm going to go ahead and reset, and we'll reorient on the Delaware Department of Agriculture, which administers a number of community grant programs for a variety of causes, right? All of which I would assume are very good. So something very simple prompt is list the grant programs on this site. This particular of all of the use cases has been particularly of interest, just given the number of grant programs that are typically available to municipalities, businesses, et cetera, right? But the sort of disparate nature of the information about those grant programs, right? So we've got the ability to reference our state content, right? So we're not necessarily pulling content from the web. We're specifically searching this page and only providing information based on this page. But maybe I want to take this a step further, right? Like we can all summarize, or we can all, copy and paste the specific grants and some information about them. But maybe I want to explore what are the differences between these grants, right? Because the time it would take for us to read through the details of each grant program, right? I could just as soon ask my large language model to do that. And what it's effectively doing, and I may need to refine this further because it actually didn't give me what I was expecting. I was expecting sort of a compare and contrast. But I can say something along the lines of, I'm call out the similarities and differences between the grant programs listed. Right, and it's able to do that. So another example of being very deliberate and very specific in terms of what I'm asking for, and also what is the action that I'm looking for. I'm specifically asking it to call out similarities and differences, right? So I want to pivot to a topic that is near and dear to my heart, and that's explaining complex topics, right? I could, sort of racking my brain for what is a complex topic in a state, municipal, or federal government context. Procurement, always procurement, right? So this is a page from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts's sort of procurement website, and it's sort of guidelines in terms of procurement for executive branch agencies, right? It's full of all of the details that we know and love, right? But maybe I just want to simplify this. Maybe I'm onboarding new staff and I really want to make this accessible so that they can hit the ground running, right? Maybe I'll use a prompt such as explain the requirements for using Commonwealth of Massachusetts state contracts for procurement. Very general question, right? And I'm going to likely get a somewhat detailed response here. I'm actually going to go, like, I could actually go back. In the interest of time, I won't, but we could actually go back and be specific and say, hey, explain the requirements for using the Commonwealth of Massa's state contracts for procurement from this website, right? The PDF or the site that I'm on right now, so that it's only pulling from this context. And then we can refine this further and say, explain this information to me, use simple language, and assume that I have no knowledge of government procurement, right? The idea is perhaps it might summarize some of the content from the document, but the document is still somewhat, and I would call technical, right? The ability to make that technical sort of information available or equitable to folks who might not necessarily have that government procurement background, incredibly important, right? So that is another area where we're able to leverage the large language model using our instructions, our prompts, right, to really craft the output. Last and certainly not least, I have an example from the Massachusetts State Senate, right? And this is a journal of the Senate. And it's basically a sort of a rough idea. You can think of it as meeting minutes for the activities that take place within the Senate, right? But it's written in I would say, a less accessible sort of way, right? So what I'm going to ask here is I want to explain, or rather here, let me refresh my, reset my context here. I want to explain Massachusetts State Senate session proceedings by simplifying the information from where on this page for an 8th grade audience, right? You'll notice Bing is actually coming up and it's saying, let's not save this conversation. The reason being, the PDF file is local to my computer and it doesn't want to make the assumption that that is a publicly available document, right? So just sort of highlighting some of the ways that we approach privacy in terms of sort of not maintaining that that conversation history, right? So it's uploaded the copy of that document or included the text of that document in my prompt, along with my ask to explain it in a simplified way, right? Giving it a persona, an 8th grade audience, which really is just to say, use simple language and sort of stay away from sort of complex topics, or if you were going to explain complex topics, do so in a simplified way. And it does a pretty good job. Now, I didn't ask for a bulletized list, right? But it took the liberty to do that. It is actually doing a pretty good job. The state Senate met at 11:06. You'll notice none of the language here is particularly call legalese, right? It's not particularly technical language by any means, but this is something that also, again, can be useful for us to generate insights based on some information, right? So I hope these examples are at time. So I hope that these examples have been helpful. I think a lot of these examples we can leverage. You can take advantage of from a prompt engineering perspective or instructions with other large language models. I just think the value of leveraging Bing is that we get to bring our data into the game. So with that, I'll stop there. And by all means, if you have any questions, we also have Tyler McLaughlin, who's our data and AI specialist, who should be on the call as well. And he's here to help answer any questions that you folks might have.
Thank you so much, Brandon. And actually, before you stop screen sharing, we had a question earlier, which was around what's the difference between asking questions in Copilot versus Bing.com. Could you, just for the sake of an example, could you take one of these that you've used in Copilot and just walk people through what it would look like if they're going directly on Bing.com?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the best way to think about it is if I need to use, or if I want to use the context of information, whether that's a PDF document that I have open in the browser, maybe that's a website that I have open in my browser, then I need to use the Edge sidebar, because the Bing website, it doesn't have awareness of the context of the other sites that I have open in my browser, right? So that's to say that the examples that we started with, right? The examples translate text below into Portuguese, where we include that text in the prompt, right? Those are going to be, we're going to get similar results both from the chat that's in the sidebar, as well as the chat that's on Bing.com. So the way that I look at it is, do I need to use or reference information that's in my browser right now? If not, then I can just use the Bing site. And that's primarily the reason why I didn't use the Bing site, is because most of the content was referencing external content.
That's really helpful. So could you just do like any kind of example on
Yeah, absolutely.
Bing chat? It doesn't have to be one of these, just walk people through.
Close these. There we go. Right. So, and I'll close the sidebar just because it's a little redundant, right? So if I head to bing.com, I click on Copilot. I have a very similar experience here. So good example. I just lost my notes. There we go. Is I'll ask to list each zip code in Portland, Maine, along with population size. Right, and it goes ahead and lists that. Aha, there's my Excel option. So there are some small differences, and I think this is something that I was looking for earlier that was missing. Right, I've asked it to list each zip code with population size. It inferred that I wanted a table, and oh, by the way, I have the ability to export that content directly into Excel. And now I have that information here ready for transformation or whatever initiative that I want, right? And like I said, right, like the only catch here is that I can't say reference data from this site, right? Because there's no way for me to show it what site that I'm on. So for that purpose, I would need the Edge sidebar version of Copilot, but for all intents and purposes, they're effectively the same.
Thank you. And just if you could just one more time walk folks through how to get the Copilot chat window on the side on the
Absolutely.
page.
So if you're using Bing, and here I want to.
And if you can zoom in a little bit more on your screen, then we can.
So just so that it's clear. So if
it's a little bit more legible.
Apologies. So the way that we get to access the sidebar in Edge, we need to go all the way to the top right-hand corner, and there's what we call the Copilot icon. It's the icon that's in the top left, top right-hand corner. If you click on that, that's what gets you to the Edge sidebar, right? So you'll see some of the historical content I have here, but if you haven't used it before, right, this is how that screen or that window should look, right? It should look very similar to when we access Copilot and Bing.com. It's just two different ways to effectively get to the same engine. It's just one gives us the ability to leverage content that's in the browser, and that being the sidebar. And then the other is just sort of a standalone website. We also have a Copilot app that's freely available for iOS and for Android that allows you to access these same capabilities, which are powered by GPT-4 on your mobile devices as well.
Thanks so much. Okay, now I'm going to just stop the recording.